Hello, and welcome to my channel. This is my first Paint With Me video. My name is Mel Mitchell Jackson, and I'm an adventure artist based in the Bay Area. Today you're going to get to watch me paint this painting you see in front of you, which right now just looks like a bunch of brown blobs on a panel. And I'm going to turn it into a painting I made of Fern Canyon up in northern Humboldt County. This video is going to be a mix of a couple of different things. I'm going to be talking about what it is I am doing as I am painting, and I'm also going to share a couple of stories and tidbits about my studio practice, where it is going, how I have gotten here, and also just how I paint. So while I am mixing up some of the greens on my palette on the right, I'm going to tell you why I have this giant brown set of blobs on my canvas, and those are my shadows. So this is actually based on a painting I made in Procreate first. I often really like to work digitally before I work on a physical canvas because I have an undo button. It allows me to plan color, and I also can get a little bit further from the photo reference than if I were working directly from the photo. So here I am layering in sort of a lime color that I made with an azo yellow, a really awesome alternative to cadmium yellow. It's not quite as bad for you. And a cobalt teal. There's also a little bit of phthalo green in there, so if you're mixing this and trying to follow along with me, which I highly encourage you to do, please. I've tried to make a goofy argument before that all art is fan art, so seriously, never feel weird about making a cover of your favorite artist's work. As a musician too, I feel that's a really important way that I find my style. A little more about this painting in particular, it was based on a photo I took on a retreat that I made for my mom. So I have always wanted to run a retreat center, specifically a creative retreat center, where people can come and learn how to make art, how to be in nature, and spend some time together being a little bit more present. So I decided as a Mother's Day gift, since my mom was coming to visit, that we would go up and visit my personal favorite part of California that I've been to so far, which is the Humboldt coast. And I was going to show her some of the beautiful landscapes up there, as well as create really, really meaningful and mindful opportunities for us to be together and be a little bit more creative. So a couple of fun things are happening in this painting now. I've added a little bit of phthalo blue, and it's creating these little teal moments happening in the shadow of the trees in the center of the composition and over on the left. And then I took that same color and I tinted it. So I added a ton of white and created this mint color that you can see that I've laid on there. And now you'll start to notice how the backdrop of that really warm sienna brown is starting to create some fun color relationships between the colors and the greens that I'm laying on top. Now I'm actually laying down a mixture of those really bright bold greens and the sienna brown that I'm using for my underpainting. Really just trying to focus on getting the shadows blocked out first and the general color relationships that I want to work with. Again, I'll show here on screen the original painting I made in Procreate, which is very green and really foggy. Because it's coastal California, Fern Canyon, this place that I'm painting, is actually right on the coast. It's just inland, only slightly. And when you start your hike, you can actually walk out onto the beach and look at the ocean. So one of the really cool things that happens here in Northern California, as well as up in the upper northwest of the west coast of the United States, is this marine layer fog. So this big push that comes through. And it's one of my favorite things to paint because of the way that it refracts the light. All right, now I'm starting to mix in a little bit of turquoise and that azo yellow again to add more teals into my background. Just kind of blocking those in. And I haven't talked about my brush yet. The brushes that I almost always use are angle shaders. I love that they are this sort of weird parallelogram shape that allows me to get a much different mark when I am moving sideways versus moving the brush diagonally. I also love that they're pretty forgiving when it comes to mixing your paint with your brushes, which is not something that you're quote unquote supposed to do, but I try to get rid of listening to all of the supposed tos in my head. Usually you can get a lot of acrylic paint out of your brushes with a little bit of rubbing alcohol. So mix with your brushes if you want to. I do a combination here of palette knife and mixing with my brushes. Palette knives are really, really great if you're going to mix up a ton of one color and maybe you want to store it for a little bit later. So it's a good thing to have on hand. I really like the angular pointy palette knives because they're very similar to my pointy angular brushes here. And this brush, if you can't tell, is deeply loved because it's covered in tape as the finish has started to truly wear off of it. Now I am mixing a dark tone. So I almost never use Mars Black, the pigment, on my palette at all. I like to mix my own blacks. It's one of my favorite techniques that I learned when I was studying painting, is being able to mix colors that are happening in that background so you can really play with their temperature. So this is a cobalt blue, a dioxazine purple, and a little bit of a phthalo green. And I'm using that to start layering in these shadows. I'm also mixing it a little bit with that brownish green that I mixed up earlier. So I am an avid player of the game The Sims, and I like to think about building my paintings the same way that I will build a house in The Sims, is really just thinking about the architecture first, right? What is the overall shape of everything going to look like? Where are the shadows? Where do I need to put light? And then once I have those things figured out, then I can start to add the decor. I can start to make things feel a little bit more fun and play with them. Now I'm going in here and trying to carve out the actual difference in the canyon part of Fern Canyon. So if you've never been there, it is a very short but somewhat challenging hiking trail walking through a riverbed that ran through the redwoods and up, I'd say 30-40 feet on the sides around you. In this particular area, it's not quite as high, but just straight up, all ferns, just lush, dripping, beautiful landscape. So I'm really exaggerating my colors in order to showcase the magic of what I saw here. A lot of times when I'm working from photos, my phone loves to flatten the picture that I've taken, and especially in the forest, things often come out a lot more desaturated than I remember them. So I like to go back in and exaggerate it. So now I'm drawing in the fallen tree and the gravel bars. That actually brings me to a little story I want to share about fallen trees, especially in the redwood forests. So I didn't know this until I started regularly hiking, but fallen trees and their decay often ends up becoming what other trees and other plants grow out of. So in those fallen trees, you're going to see tons of beautiful mushrooms, and especially around the redwoods, a fallen tree is often called a matriarch or a grandmother tree. And that I just love because I deeply miss my grandmother. She was also a landscape painter. And I think about those trees, and the other baby trees sort of grow around it like a fairy circle. And that's just so beautiful, the way that there's this balance between decay and death and these really beautiful moments of regrowth and beauty. So now I'm going in here with a little bit of purple because green and purple are my favorites. Really fun to combine them. And a little bit of an unbleached titanium. So unbleached titanium is a titanium white that isn't bleached, so it's not quite as bright and blue. So you can get warmer highlights when you're working with acrylic or oils. This in particular is acrylic. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but this is indeed acrylic paint. And I'm just working on blocking out the darker areas of the gravel bar because I know I am going to want to be a little bit obsessive later and work on painting all of the little tiny rocks on the side of this river and inside of it. Notice how I'm using my brush to kind of scrape back and forth in order to give it that sense of depth and reflection on the surface of the water. This is often what I call in painting the ugly phase, though. I call it the ugly phase just because of my own inner critic and self-consciousness, but it doesn't really make sense to a non-artist at this phase. It kind of just looks like chaos. I think I was getting really excited about this painting around this point, and I asked my partner to come in and take a look at it, and he came in and took a look and was like, what's going on here? And it's so funny how you can get really excited about the puzzle that you're solving when it comes to art. I often tell people that when I'm painting, it's kind of like putting together a 10,000 piece puzzle. I know what all the pieces are. I'm just slowly discovering how they fit together. And then in here, I've got some desaturated grays with that black that I made from earlier, with the dioxazine purple and my phthalo blue, and I've watered it down. One of the coolest things about acrylic is that you can just add some water and get a really nice wash like you would by just adding linseed oil with oil paint. I realized I didn't put enough green in the background, so adding some more of that, using my muted tone greens on this log near the front and on this gravel bar. And putting a little bit of that whitish purple on the log. Oh, and here I come with the fog. Adding a little bit of that in there with a washed out gray. So this process of painting and talking about it is actually a thing that I used to get paid to do at Apple when I first started working there back in 2019. I would sit in front of our giant video wall and hook my iPad up to Procreate and just paint and talk about what I was doing. And it was so fun just engaging with random people and explaining the little bits of painting that have inspired me to start this YouTube channel and to start sharing those little things about why I make what I make. It's fun to feel like you can connect with others through art. And I think that there's way more possibilities for people to connect with artists now than even when I graduated from art school back in 2013. Back then we had Tumblr, and I believed in that way too much. I was like, this is how I will find my audience and meet people who love my art. But it really was just a place for me to collect memes and cool things to paint, like what Pinterest is now. I don't know. If you use Tumblr still, let me know in the comments why I should come back. Now here, I am starting to lay down the structure of the trees. So similar to what I had said earlier about The Sims and building the structure and then laying everything else on top, I have a tendency to get lost in the sauce when it comes to painting trees. And I do really love with acrylic because you can lay entire colors over opaquely, unlike with watercolor where you're really going to see what's underneath, or gouache where it's not quite as much forgiving. With acrylic, it's really nice because you can just start to lay out all of your structure and then build up on top of that. So here I am, again, using that purpley black. There's actually a little bit of raw umber mixed in as well. I can tell looking back at what I did here for those trees. And that raw umber will make the purple and the phthalo blue less powerful. So I took my mom up here to Humboldt because I just, first of all, absolutely love it up here. I often have dreams of leaving the Bay Area and moving to Humboldt County. And one of the main reasons why I think I'm so obsessed with Humboldt is because of reading Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. If you haven't read Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, I can't recommend them enough. One of my other favorite authors, Adrienne Maree Brown, actually has a podcast that is structured like a book club where you can read each chapter and get really wonderful responses from Adrienne and Toshi Rogan. So I'll put a link to that podcast down in the caption if you are interested. I highly recommend it. That book absolutely changed my life. I read it mid-pandemic. I couldn't put it down. I think I consumed the entire thing within the span of a day and a half. And I should go back and reread it, but I'm going to give you the overall premise without spoilers. And the premise is a series of characters living in a compound or commune in post-apocalyptic Los Angeles. And their situation becomes untenable and unlivable, and they end up moving to Humboldt County. And maybe that's a little bit of a spoiler, but anyway, that's all I'm going to give you in regards to that book. It's awesome and sad and beautiful, but I wanted to bring my mom up here because I keep telling all of my friends that I'm going to leave the Bay Area, buy a house in Humboldt County, and start a retreat center and an artist residency. And that's just what I'm going to do. It's how I'm going to live. But then I think about how far it is from an airport, how tough it would be to see my family, and the sheer fact that there's really not a lot of opportunities to do things like teach up there. But man, I just want to live in community with others. Even when I play The Sims. I guess this is also going to be a video about my Sims love. I've been playing the game since it came out in 2000, and now it's on The Sims 4. And every time I play that game, I see it as this way of imagining different possible futures. So I play it a lot where I will actually have communities of people living together on collective land. I'll have artists and musicians living with farmers and herbalists and winemakers and trades workers and handymen. And it's really interesting because in The Sims, I often have my characters adopt or I have them have children. And the idea of raising a family, raising kids is something that's done collectively rather than as a fiercely individualist, capitalist pursuit. And I find it really beautiful to watch these things play out. So yeah, the place of Humboldt County is just full of lots of imaginative magic for me. And so it's fun to really capture that. And it was also really beautiful to bring my mom here because she is from Chicago, has never lived anywhere else, and had never seen coastal redwoods. So I kind of brought her to the top tier coastal redwood area. It was awesome. She was completely blown away by the Avenue of the Giants, by Fern Canyon, by just so many of the places that we were just driving through. Back to a little commentary on the painting here. So now you can see that I've drawn this dense thicket of all of these trees, and I'm going in with some middle tone greens. So really thinking about how light versus dark my greens are in this section, and trying to be really intentional with creating some shapes and some blobs that give it the sense of depth while also bringing some bold color in. And I've also switched my brushes here. I'm actually using a flat square-headed brush in this moment. I do really like using flat brushes when I am drawing foliage. And I made a little grip on this brush with some electrical tape, which is that pink thing you see there. Here I am mixing up some darker teal, really going in with these shadows. I also started noticing how the orange-ish brown of what I had going on in my background was starting to feel a little bit too jarring against the yellows and greens. So I'm starting to mute that down a little bit here. So if you look in the upper left corner, my paintbrushes have moved because my kitten Lupin has decided to join and say hello. She's wanting some attention here. My cats really love to sit in the window above my painting studio, so I just invite them, I let them do it, but sometimes they like to drop in and say hi. So that was one of those moments. All right, here I am cleaning off my palette knife. And it looks like I just mixed up a really nice mint green with some of the phthalo green and azo yellow that I had mixed together, that bright, bold, verdant green. And then I added quite a bit of unbleached titanium and some titanium white. Don't have exact mixes here. And it looks like the cat is back. You can see her tail and the left-hand side there. I really love adding the little bits of light coming through the trees after I've set a general area for the trees to exist within. I went to school for painting, and in that time I wanted so badly to be excellent at photorealistic painting, at being incredibly exact and rigid. And now I try to be the opposite of that. I try to find ways to get away with moments of abstraction in my paintings and create smarter compositions with how these different colors move across the canvas and live in different places. When I was teaching photography, I got a lot better at learning how to share with my students, how to make a composition move around, and it's also made me a smarter painter. So if you're intimidated by painting, I highly recommend getting into photography, because it's another complex tool that can be really, really great for helping you showcase to others how you perceive the world. So here I am, kind of carving out the edges of that gravel bar, adding the little bits of light on top of these fallen trees. A trick that I will do is I'll often use a pretty simplified color, like this white here, and then I will add the bolder colors on top just because acrylic has a tendency, unlike oil, to be semi-transparent. So if I give something a little bit more of a foundation to stand on, it can have more impact at the end. Here I am using a little bit of green to show the reflection of the environment on the water. So the reason that I created this retreat and invited my mom to go on it with me is that the whole idea behind me wanting to have a retreat center is the fact that my mom and I actually went on a yoga and meditation retreat back in 2018 together. And we really had a great time. And it also was a really important time for me to recognize where I personally was starting to break away from the teachings of mentors that I had at the time, the perspectives of art school, and what it meant to try and participate in the art world with a capital A and a capital W. And I also was in this place where I was really burnt out. But going out on this trip, and really so much of it was just being outside and spending time in nature. And it was in through those beautiful moments that I found the idea of retreat doesn't necessarily have to be a place you go intentionally away with people for a specific amount of time. Retreat can be something that you create within yourself by just going out and being in nature. So I wanted to create that with my mom. We didn't do any yoga on this retreat. We did a meditation by the ocean, which was really nice. But it was mostly just focused on being present in the here and now in the woods. My mom and I both are very busy people, and we're very fast-paced. I grew up in the city of Chicago, so I think that had a lot to do with an influence on how I'm always trying to be going, working. And luckily, my partner, who's amazing and was also on this retreat with us, is from a little tiny town outside of Yosemite near the big national park in California. So his idea of things is to be a lot slower and more deliberate. And so I was, in some ways, returning to the language of the retreat center, but in other ways, returning to one of the many beautiful love languages in my relationship and finding a way to share that with my family. So back to the painting here. I'm really starting to work on the shadows of the tree branches along the edge of this gravel bar and just working in layers. So the thing that I've found I really love about acrylic, I actually inherited my acrylic paints from my grandmother when she passed away. I used to work primarily only in oil, but acrylic is fun because it dries really fast and it works a lot like watercolor mixed with oil and also mixed with digital painting. It's its own whole thing. But here I am adding even more bright green reflections. A key thing to remember when you're painting is that the areas that are closest to you are often going to be the most saturated and the most bold. So in this, I'm noticing, the most saturated and bold areas are definitely happening all towards the background. And while that definitely is how it felt in real life, I've got to make some things a little bit more saturated in that foreground so that way it can give off the illusion of existing in space. When I'm teaching painting, I often tell my students that painting is a dance. I definitely feel like that's what I'm doing here. And it also is an illusion. So I often end up having conversations about perception and drawing from life with my students. And I try to give them permission to not be perfect by just telling them, like, hey, what you're doing here is you're creating an illusion. You want people to believe that where they're looking is real. It doesn't have to be 100% exact measured to what you saw or perceived in real life, but you can have fun and play with the ways that you make marks in order to create that sense of an illusion and to make someone believe in it. It's kind of like being a fiction writer. It's world building, right? You're using the elements of the real, tangible, physical world in order to get someone to believe in the fantasy land that you're existing within. I think fantasy novels and world building are really fun ways to look at painting rather than thinking about it as creating a replica of a photo. I feel like when I read a good fantasy book or listen to one, because I often listen to a ton of audiobooks when I'm in my studio, when I listen to a really good fantasy, it often ends up being a space where I can suspend my disbelief. So, really, here as I'm painting these rocks, I'm just trying to suspend the viewer, your disbelief that these rocks aren't real and they're not just some blobby circles on a flat panel, but instead they're rocks under a river in Fern Canyon. I used to make a lot of paintings of my apartment because when I lived in the Midwest, I didn't really like to go outside. The weather was only nice a couple times a year to do that. So I was very much an inside cat, homebody type human. And when I was drawing a lot of portraits of my home, I would do absolutely obsessive things like what I am doing here, where I would draw tiny little hatch marks for every single mark on the carpet. And here I am making tiny little dots for every single piece of gravel on this gravel bar. And just varying the different shapes. Here I am indeed using an angle shader brush, so that way I can vary my marks from kind of wider and thicker to smaller and more blobby. It's moments like obsessively painting tiny pieces of gravel or drawing all of the hatch marks on the carpet where my brain just shuts off and fully relaxes. To me, this is absolutely meditative. There I go. Taking out a little bit more unbleached titanium so that way things don't look too white. Oftentimes, if you're using too much of just the standard titanium white, I feel that my paintings look like I've painted with toothpaste, which, totally. Bleach titanium is a very toothpastey color. So here I've mixed a little bit of that lilac color that I've made before with some of my unbleached titanium to make this warm gravel. And then I sped this up for y'all. I took a time lapse of this section because as I was painting it, I was like, I'm really excited to make this YouTube video and to talk about my painting process. But also, when I used to replay my videos of my paintings when I was working at Apple, I would always skip through this really tedious part because I would lose folks. So hopefully I haven't lost you and you're still here hanging out as I start adding these details to the water and we go back to real time. So here I am using my absolute favorite brush. I think I have 5 or 6 of this exact brush. For those of you who are curious, it is the Princeton Select 1/4 inch angular shader. I have some that are more than 10 years old and others that are new. I think every time I go to the art supply store, I just pick up a new one because I have a tendency to destroy these. But now that I'm a full-time artist, I wash my brushes after every paint session. Yes, indeed. I wash my brushes after every paint session, and you should too. It is hard. But please do it. Your brushes will thank you. A funny Bay Area moment that I had was realizing that my brush cleaner that I use and has been beloved to me since I was a freshman in art school. It's called the Masters Brush Cleaner. It's actually made in Redwood City, California. So that's over on the peninsula in the Bay Area. Had no idea that one of my favorite supplies was a Bay Area thing, but it is. Neat. It's a good one for cleaning your brushes. So you're noticing I'm doing a little bit of a thing here where I'm smudging with my finger. Finger painting is not a technique I was taught when I went to art school, but I highly recommend finger painting. When I work with watercolor, oftentimes I have a little swatch sheet next to me where I'll test the color that I've mixed on the paper to see if it actually is what I'm hoping it will look like. And then I can use that little test sheet of paper and hold it over the area of the painting I want to work on. And sometimes when I'm using watercolor and I don't swatch the color first and I lay that color down and it isn't right, I immediately grab my paper towel that I always have on hand and I try to blot it out. With acrylic, if I try to blot, I often will get something that looks like a print of my paper towel on the canvas, and I don't want that. So I just smudge away or tap on the paint with my finger. And this is fine. Don't eat while you're in your studio. Make sure that you wash your hands really well. And avoid doing this when you're using things like cadmium and cobalt, because you don't want to eat any heavy metals. Be really careful not to get it under your fingernails. If I was practicing good habits, I would probably be wearing gloves, but I cannot stand wearing latex gloves while I paint. It drives me crazy. So now I'm going in and trying to define the edges of this river terrace right here. So I'm going back through here with a teal green and sort of carving out the areas where the canyon is turning to the left and there's light and fog sort of streaming through this very moist, there's not a better word for it, canyon. I know a lot of people have a definitive aversion to that word and they only like to use it when they are describing cake, and that is completely fine. But if you are ever in Kansas City and you are in the Midtown Sunfresh, I highly recommend you go over to the yogurt aisle and you look up because if it has not been remodeled, there is a giant, hilarious 1990s word art style version of the word moist. And that's what I think of when I hear the word. Oh, speaking of, I also am moistening my palette using a spray bottle. I keep a little spray bottle handy in case my Stay Wet palette doesn't keep my paints wet. And I haven't talked about that yet here, but I'm using the Masterson's Stay Wet palette, and it is awesome. As someone who traditionally works in oils, this makes acrylic, oh, there's my spray bottle. This makes acrylic actually feel more workable. I will also use the Liquitex Slow Dry Medium in addition when I want certain areas to stay workable for longer and I can kind of push the paint around as I would with oil. But what's cool about the Stay Wet palette is that it has a little sponge in the bottom, and then the palette paper themselves is made out of a texture similar to printmaker's blotter paper, so it just holds a lot of water really nicely. And my paint stays wet inside this little palette for up to weeks at a time, and that is so helpful when I need to stop painting and eat, which often becomes a moment where like I was mentioning earlier, my mom and I, we both grew up in Chicago. We both are definitely people who will work all the time if allowed to. And my partner is really good at coming in and being like, "Hey, dude, you haven't eaten. Let's eat something. Let's stop painting for a minute, Mel." But I used to say, "No, I can't stop painting. My paint's going to dry." But now I don't have that excuse. Now I have healthy habits of feeding myself. Yay. Awesome. All right, so I'm using my trusty 1/4 inch angle shader brush, and I'm using a really verdant green mixed with a tiny bit of dioxazine purple and some raw sienna, which is kind of like a yellowy orange earth tone. If you hear somebody say earth tone, it means that that paint is probably just made from some nicely colored dirt. It also probably means that that paint is super awesomely affordable. So if you're just getting into painting and you're like, "Oh my gosh, paint is expensive," try painting with as many earth tones as you can. You'll notice they'll probably say Series 1 on them, and there'll be colors like burnt sienna, yellow ochre, raw umber. Okay, now I'm going through with my dioxazine purple and raw sienna black mixture, trying to get some more shadows going in here. This purpley blob that I have in that top left corner that I just finished was actually an overturned tree. So a tree that had come unrooted and its roots were sticking up out of the ground. So trying to show that off there. Adding additional little plant stems. And notice how I'm sort of just dancing across the painting, saying, okay, I've got this color over here. How can I add it in other little places? What things do I really want to fade back into the background? Where do I want there to be little magical moments of light that come through? And as you can see, the way that I'm applying the paint here is why I truly love angle shader brushes so much. Because you can get so many different types of marks with the same tiny little brush. And it's actually one of the things that I miss the most when I'm painting digitally is I don't have my trusty angle shader brush, and I haven't quite figured out how to make Procreate brushes behave like this brush does, where I can just tilt it a little bit and get a completely different feel. If you know how to make an angle shader brush in Procreate, you should leave a comment and I will hire you to teach me, because that would be a game changer. So now I'm using a wash of a greenish color that's mixed with the purple, brown, black. Using that to finish off the shadows of these rocks along the riverbank. And we went to visit Fern Canyon for Mother's Day weekend. So it was not rainy season. So it wasn't full of water. And it wasn't super dry like it is here in July and August. But there's definitely not much water in the canyon, as you can see. All right, now I'm mixing up a slightly duller version of that green with a little bit of the unbleached titanium mixed in it. And now I'm starting to really work on the density of the branches and the bushes and ferns that kind of carpet a redwood forest. So if you've never been in a redwood forest, the best way that I can describe it to you is that it feels like you are in Jurassic Park. It feels like you've gone back in time, and it's also really quiet. The thing that helps make it super quiet is that the redwoods actually shed their needles and they turn into this soft brown carpet that covers the entirety of the forest floor. And in that gorgeous brown carpet, it's like a brownish orange, these big giant ferns will grow and they will thrive. And I'm talking like a sword fern that is the size of my desk. It's like 7 feet wide. They are absolutely giant, and they pepper the entire forest floor. So you have this really soft, cushiony bed of redwood needles, and then you have these ferns, and there's no place on earth I've ever experienced that is that quiet without having earplugs in. It is so nice, and sound just dissipates. And it also allows for you to access a certain level of quietude in yourself. Again, one of the main reasons why I wanted to bring my mom here for Mother's Day is to access that quietude and have that sense of retreat. My mom and I are both people that really can benefit from slowing down. And so it's through this slowness that we were able to find this really awesome time in the redwoods together. So here I am mixing up a couple of different temperatures of green that I want to use for my highlights. So I mixed a really nice yellow green, and now I'm making a much bolder green, and I mixed in a touch of naphthol red, which is my bright bold red that I use instead of cadmium, and that allows things to really pop forward. And here I go working on my foliage. So I'm using my angle shader brush here, and this one is my Princeton Snap 3/4 inch angle shader brush. I love this darn brush. It is so old. It has 2 layers of electrical tape on it, just barely holding it together. But man, it makes some of the best marks. And honestly, the fact that it's partially falling apart also helps it make really cool, unique marks on the page. So don't throw out your old brushes. They can become handy tools in your toolbox. So I'm using the side of the angle shader to create these little blobby kind of oval marks. Then I can make those ovals sideways, and then also just use the very tip of the angle shader to make tiny little marks of light coming through the trees. So I can make such a tiny mark with such a big brush and then immediately switch to a big chunky paint mark. Not many tools that are that versatile. You can see me just kind of tilting it back and forth here. And this is where the painting really goes from that ugly stage that I was calling it earlier. I used to be an art critic, so I'm really mean to myself when I call things ugly. I know you're probably like, that's not ugly, Mel, don't be so hard on yourself, but that's just my brain, y'all. So I'm going through this section and starting to really build the foliage, and all of a sudden the image is really starting to make sense. So up there in that top right section, I can sense the structure of what's around me. Looks like I added a color down and realized, oh no, it is too yellow. It needs to be more blue. So I mixed up a little bit more of a dull blue, and I'm bringing that forward here. And as I'm adding this layer of light on top of all of these darker shadows that I had before, I'm getting to play with both the ambiguity of not necessarily having like the exact detail of the thing, but again, going back to that sense of magic and creating an illusion for you all, for the viewer, to believe that it's real. It's also really fun looking at the temperature shift that's happening here between that bright, bold green and the more delicate and desaturated blues. Then I'm going in with this big, nice, bold green. I'm really starting to play in areas. And I used some of both my spray bottle and my slow dry medium with the greens on this top layer because I want to be able to play with the paint mixing a little bit on the canvas. Doesn't always have to be mixed perfectly on your palette. You can kind of make weird things happen as you're applying the paint too. So adding in just little dots, making things come to life, adding in all of those little sword ferns at the top of this ridge. I'm going to leave this as a moment for a music break and also a water break. If you have been watching the entirety of this video with me, thank you. But also, let's have a sip of water or tea and enjoy some beautiful synth magic by my partner. Okay, so at this point, I'm really building density on all of those magical greens, both in the foreground and in the background. Starting to add in some ferns growing on the side here. It's another thing the angle shader brush is really, really great at, is ferns. And I'm just sort of tip-tapping over here to add in tiny little bits of light being reflected in the canyon. Playing with all of my different shades and tints of color. Really savoring and saving these bright, bold chartreuses and yellow greens for the very end. And it's at this point in the painting that I'll often stop and look at it for a little bit and wonder, what else do I need to put here? Or where does something need to be? Or as I'm doing here, adding a little bit of a something and then taking a tiny bit of it away to just make a little bit of a ghost of that color, just a tiny little wash of it. Adding a little bit more of that foggy teal behind that fallen tree. Creating the appearance of more plant life coming through. Mixing in a little bit more of that phthalo green. I used to be absolutely opposed to and afraid of what I call tube green. So phthalo green, chromium green, sap green, all the greens. I used to be very, very strict when I would teach painting and also on my own painting palette, where if I needed a green, I was going to mix it myself by hand from the yellows and the blues that I had on my palette. And when I moved to California and I started painting the redwoods, that was not going to cut it. I had to let myself start using these tube colors, and it's made things a lot easier and a lot more harmonious. They have become friends. The thing about phthalo pigments, though, is that they were banned from my palette by an instructor back when I was studying painting, because phthalo is gorgeous. It is so pigmented and so bright and so bold. But it's kind of like your friend who shows up to the party clearly already having had their own party at home or beforehand. Like they're just a lot to deal with. And phthalo is a lot to deal with. It's really hard to work with those colors because just adding a tiny little pinch of it, like a tiny little pinch of cayenne pepper when you're cooking, can sometimes be too much. With the phthalos, they want to take over. They are just an incredibly dense and rich pigment, and they want to be who's boss. So you got to be really, really careful when you are using them, or they will be the boss. They will take over. So we'll talk about some other highlights and very cool things that we did on our trip. So as a part of this retreat, we also went to Patrick's Point, which is in Sumag State Park. I love that particular chunk of the coast. If you can catch it on a sunny day, you are truly in for a treat. It is stunning. It's awesome. It's very similar to what you would see in, say, Marin County and Point Reyes, if you're familiar with that in the Bay Area. But it's very magical. It's oceanside cliffs. Amazing. Other things that we did on the trip is we drove down the 1 looking for whales. So Highway 1 doesn't go all the way up to Humboldt County. You actually have to cut back through to an area called Leggett. And when you go to Leggett, you should definitely stop at this little tiny roadside hamburger stand called the Peg House. Their slogan is "Never Don't Stop," and I have a hat from them because I love going there so much. But anyway, in Leggett, the 101 forks onto the 1, and you drive through National Forest in order to get to Highway 1, which goes along the coast. And Highway 1 in California has a tendency during our very wet, rainy season to erode, and parts of it do fall into the ocean. So make sure that you check the weather and you're being really safe when you do take the 1, and drive slow. Don't try to go fast. It's a very windy road, but it's so gorgeous. It's amazing to see. So we tried looking for whales, didn't see any whales, but saw lots of beauty. We were able to stay in a place called Willow Creek in a cabin. So there were a lot of cool rivers from the Trinities that met up with Humboldt. We visited the town of Arcata, which is really cool. I highly recommend going there and checking out this really awesome restaurant called Slice of Humboldt Pie. I cannot eat gluten, and neither can my mom, and they have gluten-free chicken pot pie. So if you need a warm little treat when you are up in foggy, misty, cold Humboldt County in the spring after a long hike, it is an awesome treat to yourself. It's also just really great to walk through and explore the different shops and such that are going on in downtown Arcata. So definitely a worthwhile little destination. There's also a great tiny but mighty park in downtown Arcata called Arcata Community Forest, which is honestly not exactly on par with Fern Canyon, but pretty darn close. Really awesome redwoods that you can walk through and experience all of the lushness. So yeah, go hang out in Humboldt County. And maybe someday a real airport will exist there, and I can justify moving up and inviting all of my best friends to co-purchase some land together, and we can have our little collective living artist colony. And it doesn't just have to exist in my Sims game. So here I am, finding and refining the last details of where I want my trees to come through the foliage. So again, pulling that dioxazine purple and raw umber color together. The other thing that I think really impressed my mom with this trip is how humbling being next to a coastal redwood is. These things are tall, like crazy tall. So they are around 300 to 350 feet, which is so bananas. And their bark is soft and warm. And again, the sound of these forests is unlike anything that I have ever experienced. So if you ever make it up to Northern California and somebody is like, hey, you're going to San Francisco, you're going to Northern California, oh, cool, like, go to Fisherman's Wharf. Don't go to Fisherman's Wharf. Don't do that. Go to Muir Woods or a redwood forest nearby. You'll have a much better time. You can get clam chowder when you're on the East Coast. That's my hot take. Anyway, back to the painting. I'm really finishing up refining the shadows, and looking for areas that I think are a little bit too uneven when it comes to value. So going back through here, adding a little bit more of the bark on the frame of this tree. Now, this tree is many, many years decomposed, so it only partially still looks like a tree. Mixing up a mystery color here, it seems. Yes. A nice grayish brown with a little bit of green in it. So if you notice, we're nearing the end of the video, so I want to talk about when is art done? When is a work of art complete? And that is a really hard question to answer. I think art in the age of social media, typically people think that art is complete once you post a video of said art. And I think that's bananas. That does not have to be true at all. I think complete is really not necessarily a good word to use. Language is tricky. But rather than complete, I think just getting to a point where you feel satisfied with a painting, or you're happy with the illusion, or you had a nice dance with you and the paint and the image, and you don't really feel like you need to do that dance anymore. That's where I find the sense of quote unquote finished. When do I not need to keep on dancing? So if you've enjoyed this little video, thank you for watching till nearly the end. This is my first foray into the land of YouTube, so you should leave me a little comment or like the video, or maybe even subscribe to the video channel. There's going to be more of these. I'm also going to do more vlogs where I'm sharing more about what's going on in my studio. I'm going to be doing a lot of art and makers markets this next year, so I'm going to be filming a lot of behind the scenes as to how I'm building my booth out. I'm going to share more about the different supplies I use. I'm going to use different materials like gouache and watercolor. I'll talk about some of the different courses that I will be teaching both online and in person at Bees and Blooms Farm in Santa Rosa and elsewhere. And yeah, so if you're interested, you should follow along with my story, with my journey. Let's talk, let's be internet friends. And here I am at the end, really just going through and adding a little bit more of the light coming through the trees. Sort of the thing that happens if you look up in a forest and the light is streaming through on a really bright day. The foliage on the edges almost becomes blurred and washed out by the sunlight streaming through. So I'm trying to do that here with combining a little bit more of a blue, like an ice blue, and some seafoam green coming through here. Just showing that the forest is dense, but it's also full of little portals of light. And for this, I am using a square flat brush. So I think it's really good at laying down paint in situations like this. All right, now it's starting to feel like a canyon. It's so funny how sometimes it's just those final couple of marks as I'm watching back going, "Oh, yeah, that's when it all made sense. That's when it all came together." Excellent. All right, final touches. I'm mixing up here another bright bold green to layer on top of those little flecks of light coming through. I realized maybe there was a little too much light coming through. Some more little magical touches of bright, bold, yellowy green where the light touches. And that's it. So, thank you so much for watching this, and I look forward to chatting with you all online and off.